right, we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. Oh, for this many people? Seriously? About this amazing book? Come on! I'm expecting a little more enthusiasm. Woo! Well, we are so excited that you all are joining us here tonight for the launch of The Breeding Birds of Minnesota, History, Ecology, and Conservation by Lee Fanmuller, Jerry Niemi, and Janet Green. My name is Holly Menninger, and I'm the Executive Director of the Bell Museum. I hope you enjoyed your time visiting the Moments of Memory exhibition tonight. It's only open for a couple more weeks. It closes May 26th. And we hope that you got a good taste of what Minnesota State Natural History Museum has to offer. Before we begin, I want to let you know that we have assisted listening devices on hand, so if those would be helpful to anyone, please just raise your hand and our staff will gladly bring one of those devices to you. The Breeding Birds of Minnesota is an incredible and comprehensive work building on a long history of professionals, volunteers, and bird enthusiasts studying and observing birds in our state. As the authors note in the book's introduction, Minnesota's long legacy of understanding birds begins with the knowledge and stories of its indigenous people. And so I want to acknowledge the keepers of this place where we sit tonight, the land on which the birds we all care so deeply about live, stop over, eat, and raise their young. This is Dakota land, traditional land reserved in treaties and still important to the Dakota people today. I would also like to acknowledge the Ojibwe people, traditional keepers of lands to our north. Dakota and Ojibwe knowledge systems are crucial ways of knowing this place, the land, the waters, the sky, and its wildlife. The colonial history of exploration on this land and on our planet more broadly has harmed indigenous peoples and exploited natural resources, with legacy effects ongoing still today, including here in Minnesota. At the Bell Museum, we value the people and the communities that protect indigenous knowledge systems, and we seek ways to support them in their work. We seek to build respectful, equitable relationships with indigenous peoples. One small way we hope to do that is through our indigenous admissions policy. In honor of the Dakota people, we extend free admission to our museum galleries and planetarium to all indigenous people. Our building sometimes makes weird noises. Sorry about that. And so we invite you to make use of this indigenous admissions policy and learn more about the Bell's commitment to diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion on our website. So the Bell Museum, in addition to making weird noises, is so honored to host the launch of the Breeding Birds of Minnesota. So much of our history and the people who were integral to us becoming the institution we are today dedicated their life's work to studying Minnesota's birds and sharing their passion for ornithology and bird conservation with public audiences. This notable legacy includes past museum directors like Thomas Sadler Roberts, Walter Breckenridge, and Scott Lanyon, who is in the house tonight. I don't know where he's sitting, but I know he's here. It also includes our former curator of exhibits, Don Luce, who provided the vision for our 150th anniversary exhibition, Seeing Birds, and the co-author of the book tonight, Lee Fanmuller, who until recently served and led the Bell's advisory board for over 10 years. This legacy carries on into our present work through the work of our scientific curators. Sush Moretti, our Breckenridge Chair of Ornithology, and Keith Barker, our Curator of Genetic Resources, along with the many graduate and undergraduate students they advise and mentor. In a few moments, we will welcome our authors, Lee Fanmuller and Jerry Niemi, to the podium, where they will give a presentation about the Breeding Birds of Minnesota and offer their insights, highlights, and key learnings. And you'll see it above me. Following the presentation, they'll join me here for a Q&A and conversation with the audience. We will circulate microphones. We'll have 2 of them among you, so that please hold your questions until we can get to you. I'll also note that we have the University of Minnesota bookstore here tonight. I see that they still have books left at the table. So following the Q&A, if you would like your book signed with a personalized message, we will have Lee and Jerry in our lounge to do that. everyone who purchased a book should already have a signed book plate. If you don't, please visit the table over there. I also want to just take a moment to thank our partners and co-hosts for the evening at the University of Minnesota Press. Heather Skinner and Eric Lundgren have been awesome partners of the Bell for many years, so thank you all. Okay, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening, Lee Fanmueller and Jerry Niemi. Lee served as State Planning Coordinator and Interim Executive Director at Audubon, Minnesota, and Director of the Division of Ecological Resources at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, where she also spent 15 years working with the Non-Game Wildlife Program, the Natural Heritage Program, the Scientific and Natural Areas Program, and the Division of Minerals. Jerry Niemi is a retired professor of biology. From 1988 to 2008, he was the director of the Center for Water and the Environment at the Natural Resources Research Institute at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. His research focused on birds, the Great Lakes, conservation, and natural resource sustainability. So let's give a warm welcome to Lee and Jerry. I'm going to steal your chair. Okay, and there's your clicker.
Okey-doke. Well, thank you for that gracious introduction, Holly, and thank you for hosting us here tonight. This is just a wonderful venue to do this in. And thank you to everybody in the audience for joining us. It just really means a lot to us. Feels like old home week. Kind of, this is your life. So Jerry and I were just saying we have to just kind of calm down a little bit. We've just been, for the last hour, kind of talking at a very rapid pace, so I'm just going to try to slow down a little bit. This is the book. Hopefully you're going to get one soon. And I'd like to begin by providing just a little bit more background information about the authors, and also about a couple other people that really played a major role in this project, including the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas, which I'll explain a little bit later if you're not familiar with it. Jerry not only made major contributions to the book, he also was the designer and manager of the collection of point count data, which was one of 4 ways that we surveyed birds during the atlas. And then when the atlas was all done, he and his graduate students just did a ton of work analyzing all the data. So it was really a major contribution. Jan Green, unfortunately, could not be with us here tonight. She's going to be turning 90 in a couple weeks, and mobility is a little bit more of a challenge these days. But Jan, during the Breeding Bird Atlas, served as our coordinator for the Northeast region, and she also, for the book, wrote accounts of rare and historical species. Like Jerry and Jan, I wore many hats during the Atlas and during this book, but the heaviest responsibility was kind of managing the book production this last 6 years. And it turned out to be far more complex and far more work and far more detailed than any of us ever imagined. And I often was left looking like this, which Jerry can attest to, and my husband Gary can attest to. We had many other people that helped, and we wanted to point out Kim Rewinkle, who was a technical editor for us and just did an amazing job. So much attention to detail, reviewing the book numerous times before we even handed it over to the official copy editor. And her biggest task was preparing the bibliography, which was in the book, 50 pages with over 1,500 references. And joining us tonight, Bonnie Sample, who was the coordinator for the Minnesota Breeding Bird Program for 6 years. Well, our journey began, and I've mentioned it several times already, with the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas. And the book, this is the foundation of the book, is the atlas. Now, by now I'm sure some of you are wondering, what is an atlas? Because I know I have some family members here who may not know much about it. So we're going to spend a little bit of time in the next few minutes covering just what an atlas is, how we conducted it, how we analyzed the data, kind of preparation of the book, and then finally some highlights of the book's content. And we'll try to be quick, but I'm also trying to slow down here. Those of you who know birds in Minnesota know that we just have an exceptional legacy of information already on birds. So it's reasonable to ask, why do we need anything else? And it's a good question to ask. Well, historically, the data on Minnesota birds has been qualitative. And if it was if it provided any locational information, it was only to the county level. And telling someone that a bluebird occurs in St. Louis County isn't very helpful. St. Louis County is bigger than most states out east. The other reason we did it is, as many of you know who are biologists, birds change over time. Their distribution changes, and it changes in response to environmental variables. So at any one point in history, things are changing. I'm going to use one of my favorite little birds, the LeConte sparrow, to give you kind of an example of how things have changed over time. It's a really exquisite little bird, and it primarily has a very weak song, primarily occurs in kind of wet, marshy grasslands. Well, back in 1892, which was just one of the first major compilations of Minnesota's avifauna, Dr. Hatch wrote a book where he described the LeConte sparrow as a bird that breeds considerably in favorable localities in a large part of the state. So you kind of presume that it's almost statewide in distribution. There's not a lot to really define its distribution there. Well, 40 years later, T.S. Roberts, who wrote the tome on Minnesota birds in 1932, gave us a little bit better information about the LeConte sparrow. He said it's a summer resident throughout the prairie and open woodland portions of the state, and is apparently most abundant in the Red River Valley. So we're kind of getting a little better sense where this bird occurs. It's not a forest species, it's probably more in the west and the northwest part of the state. Well, more than 40 years later, in 1975, Minnesota Birds was written. It was one of kind of the first books after Roberts that was prepared by Jan Green and Bob Jansen. And in this book, interestingly, it was the first book that really it depicted the statewide distribution of individual species on a state map. It kind of took that long to do that. This map, the dots, both the closed and open ones, kind of indicate counties where the bird was thought to breed or confirmed to breed. And you can see the distribution is kind of moving a little bit further north, but the dotted lines indicate some uncertainty about its southern periphery. And then just 12 years later, Bob Jansen, who just recently passed away, updated the information to the book and even restricted the bird's distribution further. Less occurrence in the northeast and kind of moved the southern boundary further north. So that stood the test of time for decades, literally. But you know, the other thing that happened in the 1970s and 1980s was the passage of a lot of environmental legislation. And coincident with that was the need for more precise locational information for conservation and land use planning. And that sparked what we refer to as the atlasing phenomena. And what that is it's basically the process of geographically cataloging at a fine scale the distribution and abundance of birds during a specific time period. Now, atlasing began in Great Britain in the 1950s, and they actually started doing it with plants in Great Britain, and published a book in 1962 that became very popular. And those of you who are birders can imagine the attraction that all of a sudden there was a real purpose to birding. You could go out and get even more detailed information on birds with the atlas. And indeed, that's what happened. Atlasing crossed the pond, and it went like a wildfire in the United States and Canada. States across the board were producing breeding bird atlases. Minnesota was a little late to the game, but eventually there was a group of people that were really keen on starting an atlas. And they worked hard to secure some financial support from a variety of different organizations, and Minnesota's first breeding bird atlas was launched. We began preparation for the work in 2008, and then we did it over 5 specific field seasons, 2009 to 2013. So how did we do the sampling? It's a big state. Well, most of you know that Minnesota is divided into a grid of townships. Each of those townships are 36 square miles. What we did for the purpose of the atlas was divide each township into 4 9-square-mile blocks. And we designated the northeast block as the priority for sampling for the atlas. Now, volunteers could go anywhere in the state they wanted to, but the coordinators of the project worked very hard to make sure we got the best data, the most comprehensive data from those priority blocks, because we wanted those to be covered. There were in total over 2,300 priority blocks, so it was no small task, and over 9,700 total blocks. So how did we collect the data? Well, once the observers went in the field, they were instructed to identify every observation or detection by sound and record it as either an observed bird or a possible, probable, or confirmed breeder. And there are specific criteria for each of those 4 designations. So it wasn't just kind of willy-nilly. You had to meet certain criteria. But the overall goal was to identify as many species as possible as confirmed breeders. So how did we do? Well, we had about 380,000 evidence records that were derived from over 1 million detections for 250 species. And of those, 231 were confirmed breeders. Now, to many of you, 250, what's your benchmark? What does that mean? Well, it's a really good number because other states nearby, who were way ahead of us in doing atlases, got similar numbers. When Wisconsin did their first breeding bird atlas, they recorded 237 species. When Michigan did their first one, they recorded 233. Most of our birds in Minnesota are breeders, but up to 443 different species have been recorded in the state. Most of those are migrants, vagrants, or winter visitors. So 250 is a really good, solid number for our first atlas, and we're pretty proud of that. And more inspiring, I think, is we had more than 700 people who helped make the atlas a success. And most of those 700 people were people in the field, which I think includes many people in the audience tonight who contributed to the atlas. Our results, well, remember our LeConte sparrow. This was the map that we had in 1987 from Bob Jansen's book. This is the result for the atlas. And I hope you can see the value of the atlas in that map. Far more precise locational information, a good sense of where it's abundant, up in the northwest Aspen Parklands and the Red River Valley, and it occurs much further south than we thought. And remember, Bob Jansen's book cut off northeastern Minnesota, and we've got records in Lake and St. Louis County. So it really does, it's a much better source of data for land use planning and conservation. Well, the real fun was atlasing birds in the field and seeing all these great birds, but once that was over, the real hard work began. And the next 4 years literally were spent analyzing and reviewing the data and preparing it for a website. And we literally looked at every single record. Jerry and Jen and I spent months looking at every single record. Then all the work went into analyzing the records that we validated. And I'm just going to give you an example of the bobolink and show you what the products were that were developed from the atlas data. And Jerry's going to talk about these in more detail in a few minutes. This is the MMBBA map for the bobolink. We also developed a predictive map for its distribution, which kind of smooths out all the atlas data. We also had information on preferred habitat. In this case, those of you know bobolinks, this map is no surprise to you. It really enjoys upland grassland the most, which is on the far right. And for many species, we were able to develop a statewide population estimate, which was really valuable. So for bobolinks, we estimate 6.5 million birds. And that was done for 250 species. And then we pulled it all together with additional content information and prepared a website that was launched in November 2017. And Jerry and I just got some statistics on the use of that website, and we're just tickled that it's getting tens of thousands of hits on a frequent basis from all over the US. Then we decided we'd also write a book. Nothing better to do. And there were several reasons to do this, but first was it was really important to Jerry and Jan and I to provide a historical summary that went back to the 1700s and the 1800s and share everything that we knew about birds from that period as far back as we could to the present time. And there's been just a slew of new information in the last 100 years on birds about population trends, habitat preferences, you name it. And it was time to update what Roberts presented in 1932 in his major tome. We also really wanted to expand. We thought the website kind of spoke to more of a technical audience, and we really wanted to expand it to a more general audience. And as I was telling a couple of people earlier, we found out over the duration of the book even that websites don't last forever. Some of the major websites we used when we were first working on the web were gone when we were writing the book. So a book lasts forever. So we started writing the book. It took us 3 years to do 3 different drafts of the manuscript. And once that was done, we sent it to Oakland, California, to Wilstead and Taylor Publishing Company. And they did another round of copy editing and page design, which involved us a lot more than I thought it would. I thought we were just turning it over. And then we did our final printing this last winter. And we can talk about some of the challenges during the Q&A, but one of our biggest challenges in this book is that we had to fit the text and the figures to an allocation of the number of pages. So the vast majority of species we had to fit on 2 pages. And we tried initially to write just a certain number of words so that would happen, but inevitably it wasn't perfect. There are about 20 species in the book where we have 4 pages, and those are species that we think have special interest to Minnesotans, like the loon, or they're game species, or any number of other reasons, peregrine falcon, trumpeter swan, introduced species, etc. And we had all sorts of problems with figures and photos. That was our biggest headache, I think, but we can talk about some of those later. So I'm just going to start on a couple highlights that are in the content, and then Jerry's going to come up and talk about more detailed analysis. So what we focused on, literally the bulk of the book, is species accounts. And these are for all 250 species. And the species accounts start out with a brief summary of the life history, an introduction to each species, and this is one of the fun parts to write, because we really wanted these birds to be relatable to the public. And then we did the history of the breeding distribution, breeding habitat, population abundance, and conservation needs. Now I'm just going to talk briefly about the introduction and the breeding distribution. We really had fun trying to make these species relatable to people, and one of the ways we did that was to go back and see what other people had written about the birds. And oftentimes the greatest quotes we got were from ornithologists from the 1800s, early 1900s. These folks didn't have cameras, they didn't have binoculars, they didn't have spotting scopes. They used their language to describe these birds, and it was just beautiful, and we tried to do that as often as possible. And I've just got a few examples here. Roberts is talking about the grasshopper sparrow song. The song is so thin and weak that even the grasshopper, after which he is named, might be ashamed to have it come from its fiddle. Would never think of that. Aldo Leopold, when he was writing about the sandhill crane and its amazing evolutionary history, wrote, "When we hear his call, we hear no mere bird. We hear the trumpet in the orchestra of evolution." And even modern authors, for any of you who've read Helen McDonald's book, H is for Hawk, she just so aptly describes goshawk when she writes, "Looking for goshawks is like looking for grace. It comes, but not often, and you don't get to say when or where or how." Just perfect. So after the introduction, where we hope we've grabbed your attention, we put the atlas data in context, and we literally looked at everything that's ever been published in Minnesota on these birds, and sometimes in our neighboring states to help us interpret. So it was books, it was maps from the Biological Survey, it was journal articles, it was agency publications, you name it, we looked at it. Also that when we talked about the atlas map, we could put it in context of what happened over history. And just a quick example, and then I'll turn it over to Jerry. Most of us think of the common merganser as a northern species. Well, when you go back in time, in 1988, Dr. Hosleth, who lived in southern Minnesota, saw a female with young in Fillmore County, which is in southeastern Minnesota. A few years later, Dr. Hatch reported finding him in Minneapolis, where he saw young in the ponds and small grassy lakes. But by the time that Roberts wrote his tome in 1932, there were no records from southern Minnesota at all, and he considered it just restricted to northeastern Minnesota. And that continued with Green and Jansen's book in 1975, even the Biological Survey, primarily northeastern Minnesota. And then, if you can see well enough, this is the atlas. And it's definitely moving further south into south central Minnesota in Cass County and beyond. And if you see, there's even a confirmed dot along the Mississippi River. And that was a record we were concerned about first, but I think the person who saw that is in the audience tonight. And we know she was a very good birder and that that's a very good record. So the context here is the bird reoccupying its former range, or is it expanding its range? And it's something to think about in terms of what else is happening. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our real analyst, Jerry Nemi, who's going to talk more about kind of the content and some of the detailed analysis we did.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Yeah. You know, I hope you noticed one of the phrases that Lee had about herself, the doer of details. She is fantastic at that, and I'm very poor at that, so it was really, very, very important that we had those kind of details covered. Let's see. It's a wonderful looking crowd out here too. I just really thank you all for coming. So I'm going to go into the point counts and a lot of things that for the analysis that we completed. And I'm going to start out with just a bit about the point counts, because if you look at this map, this is the mourning dove, and the map on the left is basically all the observations we had of the mourning dove. And you'll notice there's kind of really a dense one around the Twin Cities area, and around Brainerd. They did a wonderful job of getting people out in that area, and then a bit spot out there in the western portion of Minnesota. A little around Duluth, but Duluth was a little smaller than the rest of them. But you see that there's a bias to the sampling. And if we do we do analysis and we don't kind of take that into account, the statisticians are they're gonna rip us to pieces, if you will, in terms of that. So we had to come up with a technique and a way to sample the entire state in a more unbiased way, and I think we pulled it off. On the right-hand side, you'll see basically nothing but the point counts that we sampled in Minnesota, and nice, good distribution. There's concentrations, of course, and there should be, but let's go on here to the next point. So we took that data, the data gathered during the point counts, and integrated that with about 58 different independent variables that are among 4 different classes. There are the land use, land cover, disturbance, about 9 variables, things like spruce budworm outbreaks, logging activity, emerald ash borer if we had it, and that sort of thing. Landscape features are really important, the context of the landscape of where we actually gathered that data, and then climate itself. And we analyzed that over 3 spatial scales. I'll go back to that top heading there, because it indicates, if you were the statistician, you'd say, man, there's a lot of variables you're using to do the modeling. However, the sample sizes, when you have it here and sample that many areas, it's very large. You see, we had 5,971 detections of red-eyed vireos, and that's number 1. That's the biggest one we had in terms of numbers. But when we started analyzing this data, it turns out that it was taking, even on PCs and as modern as it was in 2014, 15, when we started analyzing that data, it was taking weeks for many of the analysis. And we said, okay, multiply 250, that's going to be a long time to get this all done. So luckily at the university we have a supercomputer. It's free for us, at least for the faculty member, and so we were allowed to do that and use it, and we were able to pound through this data using the University of Minnesota supercomputer. And I just want to point on the lower right, there's a citation to a paper. Alexis Grindy, who's in the audience today, we wrote a paper back in 2016. It was sort of the start of this kind of what we call occupancy modeling. And we published a paper in one of the top journals in the country, the Condor, on the Canada warbler. But then, of course, we've repeated this kind of process for all of those species. Well, not all the species, we don't have it quite for all of them, but we'd have quite a few. Turns out 115 species we were able to model because they have enough, a large enough sample size. And we broke it down into 3 different groups. those species that have territorial behavior, such as the white-throated sparrow shown here, we could actually try to model density of the birds themselves, because they're on territory and that sort of thing. So we can express the map, as you see it on the right, in a unit per 40 hectares, which is a sort of standard, but that is equivalent to 100 acres in size. And you see, you wouldn't be surprised, those of you know white-throated sparrows, that bird is most common in the north. And actually it is one of the most common birds in bogs and lowland conifer forests, which are scattered on the upper north central portion there and along the upper portions of the north shore of Lake Superior. The second group we modeled was species that we could, we don't sing but we can detect them by sight, such as the tree swallow shown here. And we expressed those numbers in terms of just a number we could detect on 10-minute point counts. And again, then we put that map. And the important thing is here, we have the data for all those little points. And Lee showed you some of those points where we had confirmed nesting and things of that sort. But here now we have wall-to-wall coverage of places that we didn't sample, but that may be important habitat for these critters. The final one we had is for the less common species, and this is where not only the point counts come into play, but the volunteer data. If they had a GPS location, we could model those data as well. And we did this, for example, for the black tern shown here. It's illustrated by a land cover suitability, so the darker the color, the more suitable that habitat. And it's very interesting. You got that little big red dot in the upper left-hand corner there. That's one of the real special places in Minnesota, the Agassiz National Wildlife Refuge. And if you haven't been there, you go there. It's a beautiful place. Well, I made sure on the upper right there you'll see, I want to give a special call out to Ed Zelanis and Nicholas Walton. They're the two guys that really did all this sampling and all the analysis. Didn't do all the sampling, they did all the analysis for this area. And one of the things that comes out of this is the importance of some of these areas in the northwestern portion of the state. You'll see there, this is a map showing that kind of habitat, of wetland habitat. But then if you look at it, the modeling, this is the Connecticut warbler. And the Connecticut warbler, I call it really one of the most, the species that's declining most in the state of Minnesota. It is really going down fast. And if you look at where is the habitat for that species, it shows you again, this is the Red Lake peatland region out in the northern portion of the state, and along the Saxon Bog area in that region there as well, where you see that species. So it's a really important area for the Connecticut warbler. And I know that area very well. I did my PhD work in the Red Lake peatland, and at that point, back in the late 70s, early 80s, when I did that work, Connecticut warblers were actually quite common and abundant in that region. And I know they've probably declined substantially since that time. Another species that we're concerned about, the olive-sided flycatcher. Take a look at that, where that one is. That one's also found, at least predicted to be most abundant in that area up in the Red Lake peatland region, and we know there are a lot of them there. And it's sort of scattered around other portions of northeastern Minnesota. And then also Lincoln sparrow, another one of our rarest sparrows, at least in the forested region, and again showing a very pretty high density predicted in those regions up north of the upper Red Lake area. One of the other things that we did is this analysis to look at how strong the habitat relationships were species to about 13 habitat types shown on the x-axis in that graph in the middle, and showing the pine warbler. We call it a percent perfect indicator. That's not something I coined. It's out of a paper in 1997 by Dufresne and Legendre in the journal called Ecological Monographs, and I think it's a wonderful way, simple way to express the degree of, show the degree of selection and how specific is a bird to a specific habitat type. And this is one of the largest numbers that I've seen in the analysis. Theoretically, it ranged from 0 to 100, that value. And 100 means that every single time you observe that species was in that habitat type, which is seldom the case. But here is a value of 48. That's one of the largest numbers I've seen. And probably not surprising to most bird watchers, pine warblers are found in pine habitats. It's actually one of the good names for species. A lot of names don't make any sense, but that one does. And then another good example is the horned lark, shown in cropland. That's a major in the frequency diagram shown there. Also found a bit more in grasslands, but cropland is much more common and more abundantly found than grasslands at this point in time in Minnesota. But we have a lot of them there. In our calculations, I'm going to get to population abundance. In the calculations we've done, horned lark comes out as the second most abundant bird in the state of Minnesota. That's going to surprise a lot of people, but probably the one I'm talking about, the most abundant, is going to surprise you more. Unless you looked at the book already and you know what the answer is. Anyway, the third example is that all the species aren't that clean found in that one particular habitat. This American redstart on the left, and it shows the distribution of that species and found in many different habitats. You see the PPI value in oak forests is even way down at only 7. That species is primarily looking for shrubbery in the understory of these forested types. So it's not necessarily looking at the canopy that much. And so it's found in a wide variety of places, and there are many species that have this kind of a pattern. So in addition to not only predicting where these species might occur in the state, and some of the habitat selection related issues, we have the point counts that provide us with trying to make population estimates. And I would say this is probably one thing that is you won't find in too many atlases, at least done up to this point in time. I haven't looked at all 50 atlases of in the States, but I don't think there are too many that have done this, because it's fairly new technique. Most of our population estimates have come from it's called the Breeding Bird Survey. On the map on the left shows you that there are about 4,600 routes that are done across North America, most of them done every year, done by volunteers. And then on the right, you'll see those that are done, that exist in Minnesota, about 84 routes. And we used this data a lot, because in virtually all these accounts, we have a trend. What is the current trend? And the BBS goes back to, in Minnesota, back to 1967. So it's a pretty good long-term trend right now, and it's an excellent resource for that. But it's also been used for making predictions about population sizes, at least in recent years. So again, I said there's about 84 routes. There are on average about 70 of those routes are sampled per year, starting in 1967. That's about 3,500 3-minute point counts that are done every year in the state of Minnesota. I want to compare that to what we did with the Breeding Bird Atlas in Minnesota. Again, our goal was to sample every single township in the state of Minnesota. And we achieved that. We hit over 98% of the townships, including all the ones most of the ones in the boundary waters and in the Red Lake peatland. We missed a few in Red Lake peatland. Josh Bednar is in the Opsy in some place. He's the one that really went out and tried to find, get back into in these areas that are very, very, very difficult to traverse that area. Very wet, very buggy, and so it's very difficult. We didn't quite get to all of them, but we got pretty close. We got a lot of the township samples. And so that holds up to 9,100 10-minute point counts that were gathered over the course of this particular the Breeding Bird Atlas period from 2009 to 2013. Now, what we found is that some of them many of our estimates are significantly higher, and this kind of bothered me for a while. It's like, uh-oh. But as I started going back and looking at the literature, many people have pointed this out, that they're conservative. Many of the population estimates have been conservative at this point in time. But what we did is we sampled all of those roadless areas, the Boundary Waters and Red Lake peatland, and many of the species have really high abundance in those regions. And so, because of that, like Nashville warbler had a fairly low number, but Nashville warblers are really in high abundance up in the Red Lake peatland and most of the forests in northeastern Minnesota. We have better coverage statewide than the breeding bird surveys do. We also had differences in statistical tools that we used. Primarily that we take into account the distance estimation that you are from the point. And that allows us a much more precise estimate of the population. And I just want to point out that if you're really interested in this, you can jot this down. It's in this is cited in the book. There's a paper by Brandon Edwards that has 18 co-authors. 3 of them are from Minnesota. Alexis Grindy, who's over here, Ed Zelanis, who's done a lot of this work, and myself. And that was published in the journal IBIS last year. And it really lays out an improvement in how we're going to go up estimating populations of many of these land birds. So I'm really, and I'm really glad that we were able to participate in that whole effort, because I have a lot of confidence in these results. So let's take an example. Here's what we have. This is the population method that you said existed for Minnesota up to up until just the last few years. 1.6 million breeding birds in the state of Minnesota. Our estimate is 4.75 breeding birds in the state of Minnesota. It's a lot more. And I might get shot at a little bit by some of the critics for that, but we'll see. I can stand by that number. Then the most abundant breeding bird in the state of Minnesota is this one, at least according to our estimates. The previous estimates are 5.4 million birds. We estimated about 14.7 million breeding birds. Let me point out, we did about, I think it's almost 2,500 random point counts in the state as part of this whole process. Common yellow throats occurred on 50% of those counts. It was shocking, and that would tell you a little bit, that's a really abundant bird in the state. Almost half the time of a place we might randomly stop, that bird might be there during the breeding season. So that is a quick rundown of some of the results we have. And yeah, we're still kind of look that way, don't we? Sort of like, oh, we're almost done with this. But anyway, these are just some of the tidbits, if you will, nuggets, as we call them, in this particular book. And there's a lot of reading. Don't try to read it cover to cover. I don't think that's going to work very well. But pick and choose. When you see a bird that you have an interest in, you want to know a little bit about what happened to it, where's it been, is it going to increase, what's its future. There's a lot of stuff on climate change in this book as well. So in summary, this is the first time we've had an assessment for all 250 breeding birds that occur in this state at a resolution, as Lee's pointed showed you, and that is much finer than we've ever had before. And we really hope and assume that this is going to be used from guiding many conservation efforts into the future. And again, they provide very detailed insights regarding the distribution and abundance of the state's avifauna and how they have changed. Again, that change, we tried to couple all these species back down at least into the late 1700s to the 1800s of what's happened to them over time. And T.S. Roberts' book has been just fantastic in that, in order to pull that together. And again, we think this is going to be really valuable, and I probably didn't emphasize the standardization of the point counts. We have GPS points for all of those points, and what we want to do is, in the next breeding bird atlas, you go have people going back to exactly the same places, and then we can really look at changes for all those places, thousands and thousands of points. So it's really going to be valuable in that way. We have a lot of people to thank. Certainly, University of Minnesota Press, Heather and Harold, Eric, and I know are here. We thank them a lot for their willingness to publish this. We did ask for 2 volumes the first time around, but we didn't get that. And it's still a wonderful job, I think. Wilstead and Taylor, the publishing company in California that did all the editing, the design, and they did a fantastic job in that layout. And it created us a lot of headaches for us once in a while, but in the end, I think it was they did a fantastic job. I mean, realize we only saw that book about 3 weeks ago. So, and we were both surprised. Oh, it's pretty big, isn't it? You know? But you put the 2 volumes of Roberts together, and that weighs more than that one book, though. We have I think, we're almost at 100%, I think, Minnesota photographers in the book. We wanted that. We wanted to have Minnesota photographers in there on the birds. And this is going to embarrass a few people, but we were, you know, our spouses really contributed a lot to this. They not only read, my wife Bonnie, I want Bonnie and Gary to stand up. They're in the back there, please. Sit down really fast. But they read a lot of this book and corrected a lot of the grammar and the prose, etc. And I know Lee and Gary learned a lot about photos and how to manipulate photos, for sure. And John Green as well, who worked certainly a lot with Jan, but they sacrificed a lot over this thing, and we really, really appreciate it. And all the volunteers and surveyors who contributed to the Breeding Bird Atlas, and the Bell Museum for hosting this event. This is, you know, I still think of this as T.S. Roberts' house in a way. You know, he was one of the, I think he was the first director of the Bell Museum, and so this is really a fitting place to be. If you want it, where's it available? Right over there. It's available tonight. Minnesota Press, you get it. There's the, you just put those z.umn.edu, Breeding Birds, all lowercase, no spaces, and it goes right there. I've bought several books already myself. Barnes & Noble, many local bookstores, and the thrift books as well. For our final comment is we'd like to take a moment to ask anyone in the audience who participated in the Atlas in any capacity and or who contributed to the book in any capacity, would you please stand and we'll collectively applaud your generous efforts. Thanks you. There you go.
Oh, not till the very end. So we'll just go there. Court, can I have a microphone for... All right. Very exciting. Very fun to get the behind the scenes insights. Okay, so we're going to have time for a little bit of Q&A. I'm going to start though because I have the microphone first, and so I'm going to start with some questions. So this project was incredible and a labor of love, as you pointed out. It's taken a long time and a lot of effort from lots of people. So I want to hear from each of you, which part of working on this book did you enjoy the most, and which part was the hardest?
I'll go first. Well, I enjoyed the field work. I mean, it's bird. You know, I like that because it's birding for a purpose. You know, and I volunteered for many blocks myself, and that was the best. That was really the best part. And I loved. Lee and I took a lot of pictures of the breeding habitat because I've spent my whole life trying to observe the bird, but where is it? What is the habitat? And we really tried to go out, and I really enjoyed that part, going out and trying to find the best picture I could possibly that represented the habitat that bird is looking for. So. Pardon?
Well,
What's the
you go,
hardest
you
part?
go with what you enjoyed
Oh,
the most, and
oh,
then we'll do
okay.
the good stuff first. and then the hard part.
Should
No,
I have to
I
think?
totally agree with Jerry. My husband Gary and I spent the better part of 2 summers going across the state and just trying to, we always went to, beforehand, we always went to kind of put together a list of places where we knew the birds, we had seen the birds, or we knew other people had seen the birds, or there was a record of it. So we were trying to be as precise as possible, as Jerry mentioned, in terms of where we looked for habitat, and we covered the whole state. That was really fun. And, you know, it was good. Jerry, if you're going to write a book, write it with Jerry. He was really good about that. I tell everybody the best thing about working with Jerry is he just respond right away. And Jerry covered more miles in the last 7 years than I have in the last most of my life. So he would respond from anywhere. And you know, you can't write a book with people who are kind of slow to respond. So I really appreciate that about Jerry.
All right, what was the hardest parts? That made you look that way, me, with the,
You don't have
I
time.
can relate to that.
You want me to go first? Hardest part is, you know, you had three times we read the manuscript in there, but it came back many times. I guess I read that book at least 6 times. And it gets frustrating. Like you sort of get glossed over. Like, what did I read here in the last paragraph? You know, it was a really difficult part to try to go back and do it. We thought, aren't we close enough already? And again, and that was the hardest part for me, just how long it dragged on and how things, the editors changed, that we had to go back and change them again, back from what they were, you know, probably the first version. But you know, those kinds of things really frustrating.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, the book got harder as we went on, which didn't seem intuitively correct for me. I thought after each milestone it would be easier, but it got harder. And the last 6 months were really hard because we were dealing with resolution of figures that was just impossible at times. And finally I just say, I'll pay for it, redo it. I don't care. It's not worth trying. But it was, that was up to weeks before it went to the printers. So that was the hard
Yeah.
part.
I remember there came a point where I stopped asking the questions about how's the book coming. I think you were in that hard.
But I tell people there are 4 stages with my family and friends. Wow, you're writing a book. Stage 1. Stage 2. How's that book coming? Stage 3. You still working on it? Stage 4. Don't ask.
Okay, we have our Bell team, do we have a microphone that we can go into the audience? People have questions. I have a whole list of questions, but all of you have been sitting here so patiently. So raise your hand. Our team will come to you. I see one over there. I think Ellie's running around with the microphone.
Congratulations on a beautiful book, absolutely gorgeous. One question, there's also a beautiful website. What am I missing by just looking at the website?
I'm glad you asked that, Steve. I'll start out. One is, we updated everything. And I can't tell you how many things changed between the time the website was put on in 2017 and when we did the book. One of the things that changed, I think twice while we were doing it, were the population trends. Because the BBS data that Jerry talked about is updated every year, because people do it every year. And they've kind of backed down to just analyzing it every 2 years and putting it on. But Jerry would get these panicked emails from me. They updated it again. I think that happened twice. So the population trend data is all current. We kept updating it with new references. I'm not thinking clearly. What else?
I would say, I want the data and the analysis and the whole thing to hit the biggest audience possible in the state of Minnesota. So the combination of both the website and the book, I think, accomplishes that. And it is, the writing is much more condensed in this book than it was there, because I think at least it was almost double, I think, what's in the website, and we had to really knock it down. That was really hard as well, to go from 3,000 words to 1,500 words or something like that. So and I think there's a lot of encouragement. I received encouragement from a lot of people who say, you need to make this into a book. So.
I think the other thing that changed was the taxonomy a couple of times.
I was gonna ask that question.
We had to reorder the counts, and we even missed one in the last. The northern goshawk is now the American goshawk, and you'll see it as the northern goshawk in the book. And then the introductions that I've mentioned a number of times. We really put a lot of work into the introductions of these species to really make them relatable to people. And that was fun to do that. And that's not on the web at all. But it's a good question, Steve. Thank you for asking that.
Other questions? Oh, here. I'm gonna bring the microphone to you because I'm closer.
Good job, guys, and everyone involved. You guys both mentioned the effect of climate change, and are there a couple of examples of birds that you really noticed, and what were the reasons? Like, what's happening? Is it like mismatches with plants, mismatches with prey, new species is coming together that weren't before? Like, just a couple examples I'd love to hear.
Let me just, I'll just say something about the analysis we used. We didn't cover a lot of detail about the analysis, but I'll give a credit. National Audubon has a fantastic website that they developed that's looking at climate change, all these species, and maps. You can get into the maps. You can go to the scale up and scale down with it. They're just fantastic. And it's a big modeling exercise, just like partly what I showed you, where they had a lot of land cover data, climate data, and they made projections based on the IPCC climate scenarios in that analysis. And it's a fantastic website. If you want to know more about climate change, we use that and is included on virtually every species in the conservation.
And I'll just add, that's another thing that changed between the website and the book. The initial models that Audubon did were pretty rough. And those are the ones that are presented on the web. They came out with much more robust models the second time around, and that's what's in the book.
So I'll just try to give one shot at answering your question. I was surprised at how it's a pretty scary analysis when I looked at it. Like, what? I mean, I think in the boreal forest region, I think we have accounted for 28 species that are probably going to be extirpated by 2050 under the current scenario of climate change. And the first one, not even the more, the more aggressive ones. It was pretty shocking, I guess. 28 species to be gone from the state by 2050. I don't know, that seems pretty aggressive to me, but who knows? What if they're off by 10 or 20 years? Is that big a deal? I mean, it's just scary what the situation's going to be.
And I think we don't know enough about how the habitat's going to change in Canada. And it's hard to know exactly what's impacting these species because you can look at climate change, but there's so many other things going on as well. It's hard to kind of pinpoint what it is. But when you talked about Connecticut warbird, that's the species that's at the top of the list in terms of our concern in Minnesota.
Other questions? I got filler questions. All right, John, we'll bring my phone here.
So you said every 15 to 25 years. So 2028 is 15 years. Have you started nudging anybody to start putting together plans? And are any of those people sitting in the room?
They are, and we have. We won't embarrass them by bringing it out, but yes, we're very serious about that. That's one of our biggest concerns is that it really is repeated, and we have begun some talks.
20 years, that's 2027, we're going to start planning for 2029, start of the field season.
Yeah.
There's no reason we can't do it. I think we should.
The second edition of the book will come out in 2040.
Just making sure everybody heard that. John's like, the next edition will come out in 2040. Prediction. Mark it on your calendar.
Thank you so much. How did you divvy up the birds? How did you figure out who's going to do what, when, where? Like, you're from the northern part and from the southern part? I don't know, help me.
No, it wasn't quite like that. It was a little bit like that, but not quite. No, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just answer that.
Were there any species you're like, nope, it's you?
I'll take a shot at it. I think, I spend most of my time in the woods, in the forests of the north. So I got a lot of those species. And I got a lot of the raptors, and I got a lot of the game species, because I am a hunter. I don't necessarily hunt all those species, but so I got a lot of those species, and I think Lee's from the south, so she took more from the south. I think that was kind of one of the big dividing points. And Jan took a lot of those very rare species. That's chapter 4, I think, is what it is. She basically had a lot of that section, and many other species that are also rare in the state of Minnesota. That's what she wanted to work on.
What were the aha moments?
Connect.
That was just thinking about how you connected, like, oh my gosh, look at that.
The question up front was, what were the aha moments? I added a little extra.
Actually, well, I think the Northwest Wetlands was certainly one of them, how important that is. Another fun one for me was the purple martin. When you look at the map of the purple martin, there's constant, the big lakes are totally encircled with dots, because that's where the purple martin houses are. So if you look at the southern shore of Lake of the Woods, it's totally dotted with occurrences. If you look at Mille Lacs, it's totally encircled with confirmed breeding records because of purple martin houses. So that just popped out. That was kind of fun. So that's one.
Yeah, I guess one comment there are many of these aha moments when I really looked at detail at some of T.S. Roberts' book. And probably one of that, I was just like, what? The common raven, go look at the common raven. He said in there, the raven is going extinct. That was so bit shocking to me. It's like, And I think he would be so happy today, if you were alive, that, look at the ravens are doing very well. They're one of the species that's actually seems to be moving south as well. So that was a bit of a shock to me. And there are several of those kinds of instances. Bald eagle, he'd be so happy today if he was living. The bald eagle, he said he thought that one was going to be gone too.
I think we have a question over there, Ellie, you want to make?
Hello, yes. My question, could you explain, I heard the words, I think, estimates, projections, like statistics. Can you explain about that, please?
Well, I guess that belongs to me. The analysis is, we basically, and the reason we did it is we can't cover every piece of land in the state of Minnesota, impossible. So we sampled it, and we did the statistical analysis to estimate or predict whether the conditions are potentially appropriate for some of these species in other areas of the state. We did test it to some extent already. We do what's called a leave out type analysis. So about 10% of the data we left out, and we put it back in to see how well we did based on the analysis of the other 90%. And there's a lot of iterations that go on like that in current kinds of analyses we do. Why it took so long to run some of these things. With Bayesian analysis is a portion we used in this to try to check it out. So the prediction is saying, we think the conditions are right, and that's why we can do wall-to-wall coverage in a sense. We see where it's all blank, we say, well, that species probably doesn't kind of occur there, but other places that are, hey, this looks like really ideal conditions where we've seen it, where we actually have data that says that the conditions are right for this to be where that species is at. So I think there's a lot of testing that could be done, but it's projecting into areas that we didn't actually sample.
I'm going to ask you a question, and I'll come to you next. Sorry, I have a microphone. As the director of our Natural History Museum, I have to ask the question about what role do natural history collections of birds, or what role do those play in informing our understanding, your understanding of bird biodiversity in Minnesota?
Well, I think one quick answer is Roberts used that extensively. You know, back in the early days, it was all collections.
Right.
That, you know, people didn't use song, they didn't have sonograms or anything. So a lot of the early history of these birds was by, in fact, we've got some examples in the book. I think one that I can think of is the bank swallow, where Audubon thought, you know, that bird just looks a little different, so he just shot it. And then, and he said, yeah, this is different. You know? So when you look over the past 100 years or so, collections have been really important.
Yeah, there's I don't know how many people have a collection of Arthur Cleveland Bent books. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic collection of books. It's all about natural history in there, and we mentioned that, but we have a lot of references to that information. There's a lot of insight on natural history of these species.
All right, I see yours is a question.
It's a great book, can't wait. Thank you. I have a question on surveying. When you said the common yellow-throat was the most abundant bird, but it's also the noisiest and most recognizable song. How do you guide your surveyors to I don't know, not use their ears or hear the quiet ones?
I didn't tell you, the people I had surveying, I didn't tell you what they had to do to qualify for my surveys. They had to pass a test of 83 bird songs. So we tested them. They had to be tested for their hearing ability. It was in normal ranges, and I can't pass that test anymore because I got hearing aids and I don't hear them. And we also do a standardization of going out in the field, everybody going out and doing estimations of distances and discussing that. So there's a short school, if you will, before you go in the field. So now I think the common yellow-throat, I think I even have it in the book. We said there might be a slight bias in that one, in that estimate. I think it is maybe a little bit high because they occur in ditches and some of these things are real close to the road, and you can detect them. But you can detect them farther away as well. It's for at least 100 meters for sure, in my mind. So it's not perfect, but I think prove me wrong. I guess that's what I'm going to say. That's why I said.
I see a hand raised.
Can I just say, I think most models, am I correct, nowadays also take into account the detection distance for these birds, or at least relatively
Well,
so.
in breeding bird survey, nobody puts in the distance that the bird was from the point. We do in the 10-minute point counts. We do. We have concentric circles. They're not down to saying this is 36 meters away. We don't do it that way. Within 25 meters or within 50 meters, within 100 meters, that kind of level of analysis. And the mathematicians have done a good job in trying to deal with that kind of information. That's in that paper that I pointed out. They have a way of doing what is the effective sampling distance, which is included in the analysis and modeling for every one of those species.
I think we have a question over there.
So, what do you think is the most underrepresented species? What bird do you think you might have missed most?
Owls, nocturnal species, for sure. And there are a number of these quiet species that are there, but owls, I think, I think that's a tough one to work on. There are owl surveys that are being done, and that was all. There's a whole list in the appendix of people that contributed data, and so all those owl surveys that were done during that time frame are in there. But I think we're a lot of uncertainty in the owls as far as I'm concerned.
All right, we'll look for one more last question from the audience before. All right, there we are.
I don't need a microphone.
Well, I want to make sure everyone can hear you.
I just wondered with the Connecticut warbler if you thought that the drought in northern Minnesota had anything to do with their drops in numbers? Because I think they were moss. Or,
That's an
Yeah.
understory.
Oh, but they're big, they're good singers. I mean, Connecticut Warbler, you can hear them quite well. We've been doing counts in the Chippewa and Spear National Forest every year, a very large sample size, and I wish I could tell you exactly the numbers, and I could put somebody on the spot in the room that might know, but I won't do that. But I think there are numbers that dwindle. That the trajectory is down. It's what's in the book as well, showing the decline in song of that activity. Now, I granted the nests are hard to find, so, but there's, if you talk to us, we have a paper out on just finished on some of the post-breeding activity of Connecticut warblers, and it's pretty cool piece of work.
What do you think the drought?
So
Pardon?
the question was about the drought. They were wondering if recent drought contributed to the
Yeah.
decline?
I can't answer that question.
I
Not
think
enough data, really.
the trajectory is this way, regardless of the weather. I mean, it is really a dramatic straight line. I think, in the last few years, only a couple of birds have been heard on the National Forest
Right.
monitoring project. It's really drastic. And the same is true in Wisconsin. Same problem.
All right.
And then, by the way, that bird has nothing to do with Connecticut. It's a
Yeah.
terrible word name for that
Terrible
species.
name. Can you leave us? Can we kind of close this down, and before we move you on to sign people's books, give us a call to action for bird conservation. What do you want people to do for Minnesota's birds after reading your book?
I want them to care enough to support habitat protection, because so many of our birds are dependent on, we have a wonderful system of wildlife management areas, national wildlife refuges, state parks, and I can't tell you how much those are centers for distribution for so many of our species. And so there's so many things you can do, but the single most important thing is to support land acquisition. And quite frankly, in some parts of the state, that's not a good topic to have more public lands. But it is what is protecting the birds that we have.
There are lots of organizations, so I can advertise Nature Conservancy. I've been a member for a very long time. Minnesota Land Trust is a non-game program. I like to go walk outside and see how many license plates that have birds on them right now. Actually, a lot of talks I give, I'll put that license plate on there first, as that's a way to support the non-game program of DNR as well.
Awesome. Well, let's give Lee and Jerry a big round of applause. And thank you. All right. We are gonna be setting up Lee and Jerry to sign and personalize books, and so we recommend if you'd like your book signed and personalized beyond the plate in your book, we're going to ask you to go through this way, to my left, your right. But before we close it out, I just want to point you all to a couple of exciting things coming up here at the Bell Museum. And so Saturday, May 18th, we are hosting a Spotlight Science featuring a number of special guests all about birds. So that include ornithologists, artists, and local bird watchers. That happens 10 to 2 on May 18th. You can find it on our website or scan the QR code. And then I also wanted to let folks know about a relatively new project that has launched by our scientific curators called the Salvage Wildlife Program. So they're calling for volunteers across the state to contribute to science by collecting freshly dead wildlife. I want to be really clear about that. For those of our staff who will be receiving this, we want freshly dead, ideally frozen things. So if you encounter a bird or small mammal, we're asking for like smaller than a fox, I believe, is the request, to bring it to us, and that our scientific collections team will be putting those into our collection and also doing a bunch of research related to distribution, the spread of disease, and the like. So details can be found again using that QR code. It's also on the homepage on the Bell website. My friends from the University of Minnesota Press wanted me to share with you, if you haven't gotten enough about the breeding birds of Minnesota tonight, you have more opportunities. So we have coming up on May 30th, we and Jerry will be at the University of Minnesota Duluth Library, and that'll be at 12 p.m. on May 30th. Information about that can be found on the University of Minnesota Press website. On June 4th, they will be doing a virtual event with Audubon Minnesota, so you'll want to visit Audubon Minnesota's website. And then coming soon, on a date yet to be determined, but check the University of Minnesota Press website, they'll be doing a signing at Wild Birds Minnetonka. So if the line is too long for you tonight, you can go hang with them in Minnetonka. And with that, what? But there is no date yet, to my knowledge, and so check in with our friends from the University of Minnesota Press. So thank you all for being here tonight. It's been lovely spending time with you. Have a great night.